And all right. And let's do the little share. And we're off. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. It really is such a great honor. Just, everyone that's pitching in, Duncan, Patrick, Ming, and everyone else. I know there's other people that are doing things as well. You guys are just great. I really appreciate you. Duncan, congratulations on 38 years. That's amazing. That is really cool. So yeah. So I'm glad to be here. I I spent a lot of time preparing these, and I had 3 talks. Well, I did the interview with Bill yesterday, so this one's coming to you hot. This is a hot take. I typically Ming wants to hear them, and we'll talk about them before, but we haven't had time, so we'll see how this one goes without the training wheels. Um, we are going over chapter 5 today, living myths and dying gods. Oh, by the way, too, I want to say I'm going to try to keep this one at about a 1.25 pace instead of the 1.5 pace I was at last week. So yeah. And so yeah, chapter 5, living myths, dying gods. And obviously, this is the book that we're going through, The Shadow of a Figure of Light. The archetype of the alcoholic and the journey to enlightenment. So, and I like to say this with each kind of introduction, is that these seminars and my book especially are not very good replacements for the program of the 12 steps. Bill Wilson was a much more inspired individual than myself. And we're going to be going through a lot of stuff, especially beginning this week, that it really helps if you've done the steps to really understand what we're talking about, and if you have that experience. So I do encourage everyone to get a sponsor, work the steps, because that's really the foundation of this, certainly of my book and of everything good that I know about transformation. So I was reading through so when I was writing the book, I read quite a bit, and I came across this really interesting footnote, and I'm just going to put it up here. This is actually the editors of the collected work. So this is not Carl Jung. This is something that they wrote as they were, trying to piece together this profound sort of epistemology that Jung was building. And it is very profound, and it just has so many layers, and we're going to start to get into those a lot. But this is what the editors write in the footnote: every individual, by virtue of having or being a psyche, is potentially the self. It is only a question of realizing it, but the realization, if ever achieved, is the work of a lifetime. And so what we've done up to now is sort of laid the foundation of the historical aspect of this myth, of Jung's myth, of Bill Wilson's myth. And now what we're doing is we're turning inward, right? So we're leaving the world of what they would call physis, or the physical world, and we're entering the world of the spirit. And this is hopefully where we all learn and discover and begin to uncover our own myth. And I appreciate that Duncan mentioned that we're not per se doing shadow work. This isn't necessarily the kind of a workshop where we're going to have assignments and stuff, but also, like, it is a quest here that we're embarking on towards self-discovery or self-realization, and that's going to be a big pivot starting right now. There's going to be a lot more personal, and so we're opening step 2 of the book, and I called this a psychological approach to the 12-step myth. And I actually stole this title from Jung's essay, which some of you may be familiar with, called A Psychological Approach to the Dogma of the Trinity. And I felt that there was enough correlation that I could do that. And that's in volume 11, by the way, which is one of his best books. It's called Psychology and Religion. And when Jung opens that essay, he starts with this. It's in the introduction, and it's from St. Augustine. It says, "Go not outside, return into thyself. Truth dwells in the inward man." So this is a fitting quote for us as we transition, right, from the exterior world to the interior. And we're, we're trying to become more conscious of what I'm going to call the self, and we'll get into the self more and more as we go. So when Jung wrote this essay, he understood that he was going to be challenging people's preconceived notions regarding the dogma of the Trinity, right? He often was accused of psychologizing God, and he actually didn't like that. Um, he was doing something different. Um, it wasn't psychologizing in the way we use that term. It's just more of like trying to discover how these things exist within us, right? And so it's not that God is a symbol or like a representation of something in the unconscious, or but it's more that these things exist in us, like we are them, right? So, and it's about uncovering those energies. um so and but so when he wrote this essay, he recognized that he was going to be challenging these preconceived notions that people had regarding Christianity, and I have to say that the same thing is true for us. As we kick off into new territory, we're going to be looking at the symbols and the 12 steps and the dogma surrounding this whole kind of spiritual practice from a much different angle. And so we want to try to stay open-minded. And I like, and this is also in the introduction, his introduction to the psychology, or to the dogma of the Trinity. And this is what he says. And I like this quote because it kind of reminds me of maybe some of the things we talked about last week, some of those questions that were raised, as well as, in the interview that I did with Bill Shaver yesterday. So it says, faith is a charisma not granted to all. Instead, we have the gift of thought, which can strive after the highest things. People who merely believe and don't think always forget that they continually expose themselves to their worst enemy, doubt. Wherever belief reigns, doubt lurks in the background. And what kind of dawned on me, as I was writing this presentation, is the fact that, even in the process of the 12 steps, we begin with belief, right? In 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 step number 2, we come to believe that this power can restore us to sanity. And then by taking the journey that's prescribed in the next 11 steps or 10 steps, what happens is that belief turns into, it actually turns into, it turns into not just knowledge, but actually experience, right? And once we have these experiences, we don't really rest on faith anymore. And that's been my experience. So we're not talking about faith here. Jung considered himself as a scientist. And when he was asked whether or not he believed in God, he commented, he said, no, he said, this is very hard to answer, but no, I don't believe, I know. And once we understand Jung's conception of God, then we can understand why he said that. And always keeping in mind that the 12 steps as well as Jungian psychology are both, but they're on the path, they're on track to lead us to the same place. So even though they run parallel. um so we're in chapter 5, and so this, you might be interested to know that this particular chapter used to be the original introduction to the book. So before I had uncovered the story of Jaime and how that leads into Jung's, discovery of his own meaning, myth of meaning, and then his subsequent analysis of Roland Hazard and how all that ties into the 12 steps, I didn't have any of that in there in the early draft. And I actually use this chapter 5, as the preface to the book. So and as I was trying to combine this historical section that we just looked at, part 1, with the rest of the book, right, part 2, 3, and 4, um I needed to build a bridge. My editor was really good, and she's like, we can't just like launch into this stuff, like we need something. And so I had the idea of just using the preface. I just put it in there and called it chapter 5 and kind of tweaked it a little bit, and it ended up working pretty good. So, but the problem with that is, like, for a presentation, and I noticed this with the introduction we did about 5 weeks ago, was that it's hard to give a presentation on an introduction because it covers so much ground, right? It's like all these different concepts in one chapter, so it makes presenting it a little more difficult. It's kind of diluted, I guess, but we're going to give our best shot. So this is the first paragraph that we encounter as we open part two. It says, having explored the circuitous path of how the lives of James, Jung, and Wilson intersected, forming a passageway through which the 12 steps could emerge, we're now ready to take a deep dive into the nature of the journey within. For as Jung was observing psychological transformation from an analytical perspective, Wilson, channeling his own style of Jamesian pragmatism, fashioned a simple set of actions to set it in motion. By drawing parallels between the two approaches, we position ourselves to better understand the mystery of our own spiritual awakening. The journey of the steps, like that of Jungian analysis, is one that spans the breadth of our being, from our highest spiritual aspirations to our lowest, most depraved secrets. Where these converge, there is the potential for us to discover our own personal myth, to close in on the elusive goal of enlightenment. And so we're kind of jumping right in then, right? And as we pursue this goal of enlightenment, I just want to remind everyone what Jung had said about enlightenment, and really, which was I opened the book, the introduction had this quote there. It says, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. And so right away, we begin to challenge our conception of what it means to become enlightened, right? Even I think in the 12 steps, we're guilty of this, that we think that enlightenment comes by us imagining figures of light, right? The higher power is this good thing, and we need to be good people. And that's not to discount that, but what Jung's telling us here is that there's actually more spiritual power to be discovered by tapping into the darkness. And that's what it means then to do shadow work, right? It's that to make the darkness conscious means to become aware of the shadow and to experience the shadow. And what that also means is that to have an experience of the shadow is to be in the experience of the unconscious directly. Okay, so it's not a theoretical thing, right? But it's to actually participate with the unconscious. Let's see here. Why isn't it switching? There we go. So when he says that the idea is to make the darkness conscious. So we go back to our definition of ego, which is that the ego is the vehicle of consciousness, right? It's the part of the psyche that is aware, that is sort of our personality, our likes, our dislikes. And so when we're making the shadow conscious, what we're trying to do actually is to become aware of our unconscious compulsions. You could also say that, like in step 11, that we sought to improve our conscious contact with God. And if we say God is a metaphor for the unconscious, then we see that step 11 really boils down to our doing shadow work. I want to read this because Jung kind of gives us a hint about the attitude that we might employ as we go about this. The psychological rule is, oh, this is Edinger. Sorry, it's not Jung. The psychological rule is the unconscious takes the same attitude toward the ego as the ego takes toward it. If one pays friendly attention to the unconscious, it becomes helpful to the ego. Gradually, the realization dawns that a mutual opus is being performed. The ego needs the guidance and direction of the unconscious to have a meaningful life, and the latent philosopher's stone imprisoned in the prima materia needs the devoted efforts of the conscious ego to come into actuality. Together, they work on the great magistry to create more and more consciousness in the universe. And so what we're looking at here then is what is sort of, and I really like this because if we invite the unconscious into our lives and we sort of vow to try to pay attention to it, then what we'll notice is that it's always trying to get our attention. And and that if we have a sort of, if we pay, so I like what Edinger says, if we pay friendly attention to the unconscious, then it becomes helpful. But if we're not paying friendly attention to it, then it's actually not helpful, right? And so we can look at step 3 as the care of God. On one hand, the care of God means that God is taking care of us, right? But I think on the other hand, we could say that the care of God is almost like we've subjected ourselves to be sort of imprisoned in this concept of God. And I think the unconscious can actually really do both things, right? As we are pretty aware of here in the 12 steps. And so also too, some of the quotes I pull from as we go through this work are gonna refer to alchemy, because alchemy is really kind of it's a really good foundation for looking at symbols, right? So myth is one set of symbols, and myth is like the collective dream, right? The myth becomes the collective dream, whereas our own dreams are our personal myths. And what Jung had discovered about alchemy in particular was that alchemy is really a good way to examine dreams because it's far more specific, and it was developed over the course of centuries. And that the symbols in alchemy often are reflected in dreams of modern men and women. So obviously we have these guideposts of symbols, right? As we kind of turn and head inward. And viewing the steps as a set of religious symbols actually helps us to see them from this unique perspective. So I say that, and this is the second paragraph, it says Jung saw myth as a window into human psychology, and viewing the steps as a modern myth allows us to apply Jungian theory to unpack them. The difference between the steps and the myths of ancient cultures is that in the steps, the highly symbolical film has been wiped away, revealing a clearer picture of the psychology at work in spiritual awakening, exactly what Jung and James studied throughout their careers. But one could argue that since symbolism is the language of myth, removing a symbolical layer or two from a religious statement should disqualify it from being classified as such. In other words, when I try to sort of constellate the 12 steps as a myth, all of the smart people say, hey, you can't do that, right? Symbolism is the language of myth. So if you're erasing symbolism, how are you going to tell us that what is left is still a myth? And that's one argument. The other argument comes from the really smart people like in AA or NA or whatever, who say that AA is not a religion, or that NA is not a religious program. And I want to challenge that sort of concept right away, not specifically, because I don't want to offend anyone, but I want to look at the word, specifically the word religion. So I actually use the words religion and spirituality kind of interchangeably. Also, I think Bill Wilson sort of used them interchangeably too, which is kind of proven by the fact that he originally had the word religion, spattered all throughout the big book. But then a certain psychologist, I think, or maybe it was Hank Parkhurst, suggested, hey, maybe we should take out the word religion and just replace it with the word spirituality. And he said, okay, no problem. So they took out the word religion and inserted the word spirituality, so as to not offend us sensitive alcoholics and drug addicts, right? But if we look at this, the word religion comes from a Latin really hard. I don't speak Latin, but so I don't know how to pronounce it, but it essentially means to bind fast. It's similar to the word yoga, actually, which means to yoke, right? And so the purpose of religion or religious symbols is to bind human beings to the gods, right? Or to build, to make a connection, right, between the energy that religious symbols evoke to the human soul, right? So that it's almost like plugging into a wall, or like combining two wires or something. So that's the purpose of religion and religious statements like the 12 steps. The paragraph continues. After all, so remember, we're talking about why the 12 steps can't be considered a myth. Anyone who has attended a 12-step meeting will have noticed among the misaligned rows of fold-up chairs strewn about the coffee-stained floors a lack of rites, idols, or altars that are typical of places of worship, ancient or modern. In fact, in the rooms where 12-step meetings are held, there's almost nothing resembling either religion or mythology, aside from a cheap vinyl banner printed with those 12 enshrined tenets. Never mind the motley crew professing to have found a genuine spiritual awakening as a direct result of practicing them. And I have to point out right here that when I wrote this, I was thinking about Yisrael's shares where he'll point at the 12 steps and say, do you guys understand that those are window shades? Those holy words right there are printed on a $5 roll-up window shade, a vinyl piece of plastic, and it's so true, right? And that's the one thing, right, in the rooms that resembles religion. But the I guess the lack of symbolism isn't the only thing that sort of prohibits us from classifying the steps as a myth. So I go on here. Furthermore, those who have familiarized themselves with the book Alcoholics Anonymous know that it too lacks the mythos we've come to expect from our religious texts. The big book tells no story of the creation of the world, renders no universal fall of mankind, and preaches no redemption, no plan of redemption from that fall. In it, there are no portrayals of burning bushes, miraculous sea crossings, or appearances of angels carrying direct messages from God. Most notably, neither the Big Book nor any of the 12-step fellowships have anything whatsoever to say about the afterlife, aside from mentioning that those who die clean and sober go off to the big meeting in the sky, which frankly sounds more like hell to the rest of the world. But joking aside, while the Big Book does have plenty to say about God, religion, and spirituality, its interpretation of such seems rather Philistine compared to how other religious traditions have consecrated their doctrines and creeds, at least on the surface. Yet those whose lives have been transformed grant to it far more canonical significance than they do the other big book, the telling phrase one might hear used in reference to the Bible. For what a person finds in the rooms seems to be of far more spiritual significance than anything else they have come across in years of desperate searching. And since no one ever aspired to become a member of a 12-step group, any loads of spiritual insights contained therein still remain largely untapped by the broader public. Most have concluded that the big book couldn't be much more than an instruction manual on how to stay away from boozing and using, seeing that 12-step meetings are just a place for alcoholics and addicts to go for peer support. And so obviously I'm sort of I'm calling into question, I guess, the normie, conception, I guess, of our 12-step groups, right? Um, the problem, so I've come to realize that what we're doing in the 12 steps is really on par with what Carl Jung was trying to produce through his own psychological process of individuation. And it's a very profound, paradoxical process that, as I said before, it involves both the highest and the lowest of our natures. But the problem is that nobody wants to go to a 12-step meeting to figure it out. It's just too boring. We only go there because our lives depend on it. And even then it takes 10 or 15 years for the real depth of the program to really start to take hold and for us to really start to understand just how profound and paradoxical this whole situation really is. That's why I gotta, shout out to Richard Rohr, friend of the channel, right? He actually attended 12-step meetings and sat there patient enough for, I don't know if it was years, but he finally began to understand just what's taking place here and how profound this process really is. And I also love this right here. I remember I was reading this chapter with Ming when I was writing the book, and she was so embarrassed by that last phrase, like that couldn't be much more than an instruction manual on how to stay away from boozing and using, right? That's just like another cheesy thing we say in the rooms, right? That just is just embarrassing, and I'm trying to make this case that no, the 12 steps are really profound, but you can't really escape just how cheesy they are on the surface. And I think, just one more comment on that. It's kind of like, the Japanese koan is like this. There are these paradoxical sayings that are meant to sort of entrap the ego. And I think in many ways, the sort of the simplicity and the lameness of the 12-step fellowships is also meant to sort of entrap the ego, right? It's like one more sort of wall that the ego has to jump over in order to get this thing. Um, so I'm going to read another paragraph. I'm really proud of these paragraphs, so I'm just kind of reading them because it's hard to repeat this stuff, and I might as well just read it. However, comparing Wilson's program of action to Jung's very dense epistemology with its basis in all types of mythological symbology, that's a little too wordy. We see that the 12 steps is in fact a clear, precise, and unparalleled expression of a modern myth of expanding consciousness. Examining 12-step customs and practices closely, including the extensive oral tradition that accompanies them, we'll see that indeed the mythos typically associated with the ancient tales does in fact permeate the 12 steps, discovered within the psychological process they present, meant to lead one ever deeper into the realm of the unconscious. Still, what follows is bound to raise the hackles of more than a few in academia, and ironically, even a few Jungians, who may be resistant to giving equal footing to the ideas of a man lacking in formal education and training as Bill Wilson was, as they would to Jung. Yet, based on the 12 steps' widespread success, it would be folly to exclude them from any serious consideration of psychological transformation in the West today. Then again, even some of the old timers in the fellowships, themselves the entrusted bearers of the torch of 12-step methodology, will balk at what follows, averse to the idea that their spiritual program should be exposed to an in-depth inquiry from what will probably feel like a sterilized scientific perspective, as if the mystery of our spiritual awakening could be more clearly elucidated by examining it under a metaphorical microscope. What they may not realize, however, is how lucky they are to have been initiated into a mystical tradition so penetrating that none but C.G. Jung himself could really circumscribe it. And so, you know, writing this book, I have two main audiences, right? On one hand, we have the psychologists, right, the Jungians, and on the other hand, we have the 12 steppers, and you know, and there's going to be doubters on both sides, and so I'm just trying to call them out like right away, right? Um, you know, on the Jungian side, they are resistant to give footing to Bill Wilson. And Shaberg and I discussed this yesterday. Even the idea that Bill's spiritual experience happened while he was high on belladonna. It's like, what if Bill Wilson, the horrible alcoholic, had an actual spiritual awakening? They may not like that idea so much because they haven't had one themselves. And they don't understand, Jung's phrase about, that we don't attain enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by really plunging into the dark. That's a paradoxical idea, and it really goes against everything we've been taught. But then on the other hand, we have the 12 steppers, right? And obviously, writing this book, I was under no, I was just very clear about the fact that I would get some blowback from certain people in the fellowships if they ever even wanted to talk to me again, right? Just for this thing about, oh, he's trying to make a profit off of the 12 steps or whatever, which is just absolutely not the case. But and finally, though, what I try to really point out here is that it is true that you know Carl Jung was probably, I mean, I've read a lot of stuff over the years about spiritual traditions and just from all over the world, east, west. I've tried all kinds of different practices in my life. And the thing I love about Carl Jung is that he really encompasses all of it, right? Like he brings all of it into his writings. And then more than that, he encourages you to sort of try to integrate as much as you can and to make it your own. And then the cherry on top is what I'm experiencing now is with my own dreams. That there's so much meaning in my dreams And it's, this will probably turn into another book for me, but there's something super, super profound that's like, that's taking place in Carl Jung's mind, and he's expressing this stuff in these massive volumes and these really hard to read books, and he's just such a profound person. And I am so proud to be able to report to the world that, hey, Carl Jung is, yeah, he's up here, but I'm telling you what we're doing in the 12-step fellowships is on par with that, and that you should pay attention. And so I try to be really clear when I say that it would be folly to exclude the 12 steps from any serious consideration of psychological transformation in the West today. And frankly, they do discount us. And the point that I make is that, yeah, and we're not doing much proselyting outside of our own, towns and stuff, because we have our hands full trying to save lives. And most of them just don't get it. So moving on. Um, as the previous quote stated, there's power in traversing into the unconscious, right? And that's where the power is that kind of yokes us back to the gods. And we use different symbolical actions to make this happen. I just want to touch on this real quickly. Jung says, since earliest times, men have had recourse in such situations to artificial aids, ritual actions such as dances, sacrifices, identification with ancestral spirits, etc., in the obvious attempt to conjure up or reawaken those deeper layers of the psyche which the light of reason and the power of the will can never reach, and to bring them back to memory. For this purpose, they used mythological or archetypal ideas which expressed the unconscious. And certainly within the 12 steps, we're actually doing the same stuff, right? There's these sort of ritual actions, these artificial aids. We make, there's sacrifices, not the kind with blood and stuff, but we certainly are doing everything we can to reawaken those deeper layers of the psyche. And so what we're participating in then is something very akin to an old religion or an old myth or an old cult or whatever you want to call it. So I want to just read this. It says, despite being rooted in modern psychology, and this is in the book, in my book, despite being rooted in modern psychology, the 12 steps nevertheless encompass many of the same images from which other world myths have derived. Like Jung's analytical method, by showing us how to engage in a process of self-reflection, the steps help us to unlock the power that such images evoke, whether we consider ourselves religious or not. And so the beautiful thing about the 12 steps is this spiritual democracy that we get to practice here, right? And when I wrote the word, that phrase, whether we consider ourselves religious or not, it really struck me, because I found it to be such good news that I don't have to go try to be one of those righteous people that Wilson writes about in order to experience to have a religious experience, right? I don't need to be religious to have a religious experience. And I'm actually trying to make the case throughout the book, and it's only just to sort of overcompensate, I think, for our sort of like hyper focus on these images of light. But the case that I make in the book is that we might even do better to plunge into the dark more often, right? That the power that we're seeking is actually in the darkness. We don't need to look for it in the light. We're already in the light, right? What we need to do is take a journey into the dark. So my editor insisted that I needed to make a case as to why this book would be appealing to the masses, not just 12 steppers, right? I don't want to limit the audience. So this is the paragraph that had emerged in response to that. It says, therefore, studying the 12 steps is a worthy endeavor for everyone. It's not just alcoholics and drug addicts, for all of us are suffering from the spiritual malady that plagues the West. One could argue that our entire civilization has been rendered powerless over alcohol in the same way Jung humbly admitted that he was powerless to help Jaime or Roland. The fact that the 12 steps continue to inch closer to the mainstream and that many groups are now filled with young people says volumes about our shared longing to restore our religious connection, to quench the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God, as Jung wrote to Wilson in 1961. Moreover, the widespread nature of the disease speaks to the ineptitude of our traditional religious organizations in filling such a spiritual void. And so, yeah. And there's some good stuff in there, but the idea that the civilization itself is powerless over alcohol, perhaps kind of in that Al-Anon way, is quite a profound concept for me. As we and it just the problem just seems to be getting worse, like especially with fentanyl now, and you can see the powerlessness, right? That the whole culture is like doesn't know what to do. We can't help. We can't save the youth. We've announced a war on drugs. That didn't help. Now we're trying to use psychedelics and therapy. We'll see how well that goes. It's quite a mess that alcoholism and drug addiction have created. So the next section is called God, or sorry, I got ahead of myself. As we see in myth, so and what I want to say here is the paragraph where I introduce this concept of the anonymous alcoholic. When we look at mythology, we always have two sets of characters, right? There's the gods, sometimes the angels, the devils, whatever, the powerful beings, right? And then in relationship or in contrast to the humans, us lowly humans. And then the purpose of myth, the purpose of religion is to tie the gods and the humans together, right? And what we're going to start to do is look at those myths from a psychological perspective and to understand which parts of the psyche are represented by the gods and which parts of our psyche are represented by the humans. So we're looking at the 12-step myth from this psychological perspective. What we then do is we see the anonymous alcoholic as the human character, right? That's the character that represents each of us, whether we're alcoholics or not. And so this is what I write, sort of laying that foundation. As in all myth, the steps portray a psychological journey which includes the metamorphosis of both humans and gods alike, representative of each of us individually as we embark upon a similar quest that Jung took to discover a myth of expanding consciousness for ourselves. Indeed, the mystery of what it means to be fully human courses through the steps as an ancient myth, but now cloaked in modern language and ritual. And while the manner in which these symbols are presented might make it harder for us to classify the steps as strictly myth, it does make Wilson's pragmatic program a highly effective instrument of spiritual transformation. And that point cannot be argued. And just like Mountain Lake in his myth, or the Yachuma Way in theirs, most of us won't have to try very hard to find our own story expressed in the 12 steps, or for them to infuse our lives with meaning, past, present, and future. Studying the steps alongside Jung's method of individuation helps to uncover what makes them so effective. For the steps fulfill the same religious function that the older myths once did, but with one very important change. The characters that inhabited the central role in the ancient stories have been replaced by a nameless protagonist, whom I call the anonymous alcoholic, a relatable participant in the divine drama in which man plays in today's world. So there we have the anonymous alcoholic, right? The we of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that phrase is found in the first preface. It's like the first sentence in There Is a Solution. And it's also the first sort of snippet in the 12 steps, right? We admitted we were powerless. We came to believe. And so what we're looking at here is this anonymous character, right? And it's really it's a prototypal character. It's an archetypal character. I find it very interesting that it is the we, right? It's not just it's not them, it's not Adam and Eve, right? It's like it's Cody and me or whatever. It's the we of Alcoholics Anonymous. The next section now is called God is Dead. So and I wanted to put this up here. I actually just read this the other day in my own personal studies. So this is Edward Edinger in his book Anatomy of the Psyche, and he says, what is undergoing mortificatio, or death, and rejuvenation is nothing less than the collective God image. And so this is a really interesting point right here, because what we're going to start as we journey inward, what we start looking at right away are these symbols. Okay. And the first symbol we encounter, just like Bill Wilson, is the God image. But as Nietzsche said, like in 1874 or whatever, I have it written in the book, and I think I'll read it in the next paragraph, but he says God is dead, right? And so what's happening with that though is that the collective conception of the God image is morphing. And so in his book Answer to Job, which is I highly recommend, Carl Jung says that God wants to become human, right? That if we look at the evidence of like just in the Bible, for instance, we see that this being Yahweh like has a design to become more and more human, and that God sort of manifests right in Jesus. Now God is human, right? But then it even becomes more human because Jesus dies, and then the Holy Spirit comes, and the Holy Spirit is meant to sort of dwell within the heart of every human, right? So now God is disseminating into every single human. And if we keep that in mind, and then we look at the second tradition, we see an even kind of deeper manifestation of this, where it says that God manifests in our group conscience. So, like of all places, you're going to find God, right? It's in a 12-step business meeting, right? And so it's a really sort of this is a relative God image, right? That God is no longer absolute. God is a changing, dynamic character or energy or whatever it is. And it's going through this sort of this death and this rejuvenation. So I'm going to read this. This is getting close to the end. It says, fundamentally, the West has undergone a profound shift in our relationship to our religious symbols, our religious myths. An impoverishment of symbolism has left a gaping hole in our collective consciousness that is now being at least partially filled by a spiritual co-op of reformed drunks and drug addicts. A shift in perspective like the one that has befallen our religious symbols shouldn't come as a surprise, though, for it has oft been described since Nietzsche famously pointed it out in 1882, God is dead. The dire need for a reformulation of our mythological lodestars has been expressed by many of recent history's most important thinkers. But the notion of an impending religious renaissance was perhaps most poignantly echoed as recently as 1994 by the late Jungian author and analyst Edward Edinger. When asked whether Jung's method of individuation itself might ever fulfill the role of a new religious myth for the modern West, Edinger responded, "It is perfectly clear that Jungian psychology as we know it, the individuation process, that laborious process that takes years of the analytic endeavor for each individual, is not going to be a very widespread event. What I expect to happen will be that some collective phenomenon will emerge out of Jungian psychology that will speak to the unconscious of the masses directly. I anticipate that some kind of new mythological drama will derive from Jung's insights, presumably generated by someone with a religious genius. And if that were to happen, then a new religion would be generated that allowed the masses to affirm instinctively, as doctrines rather than intuitive facts, the basic points of individuation. That's my guess about how a new myth might unfold." And so I really love this quote because I found that the 12 steps are sort of the fulfillment of this prophecy, right? And that was my original thesis was that. And I had to tweak it a little bit to make it a little more palatable for the Jungians. And what I learned was that there's many myths of expanding consciousness, right? Jungian psychology is only one of them. The 12 steps are another one, and there are others. But there's just so much in this quote that I love. Like, for example, he talks about a mythological drama, right? And I'm going to refer to that in the paragraph that we're going to read next as alcoholism and drug addiction, right? That's a mythological drama. And that the 12 steps didn't grow directly out of Jung's insights, but they emerge out of the same sort of unconscious rhizome as we saw in part one. And I'll read this. As we've seen in previous chapters, the steps did not emerge directly from Jungian psychology, but are a phenomenon that grew alongside it, sprouting out of the same unconscious rhizome from which Jung's personal myth arose. In the chapters that follow, as we flesh out some of the basic points of individuation, we'll see how the 12 steps lead us in the same general direction as Jung's process, ever inward, where we finally discover what invigorates the human soul and inspires spiritual transformation. Such a study will necessitate a close examination of the inherent darkness in the human psyche, elucidated by the pervasive psychospiritual illness of alcoholism and addiction, a rather common neurosis that stems directly from our collective shadow complex in response to our culture's loss of mythic connection. And so there's a lot in this paragraph, because I'm really describing like where we're going in deeper and deeper chapters. Especially, when I say we're going to discover what invigorates the human soul, and how these energies inspire transformation. So all of this stuff will come later and make a lot more sense. Um, and this is the last paragraph of the introduction, I guess, of chapter 5. It says, in making the case that Ettinger's prophecy is being at least partially fulfilled in Wilson's 12 steps, the coming chapters will show how a working knowledge of the 12-step principles can help one to understand the nature of psychological transformation in general, doing so through a classical Jungian lens. So, and I want to say this about that. My editor was like, she said, you can't call yourself a Jungian. But then Stephen Herman kept insisting that I was a Jungian, and so I put it in there. And then he also pointed out that I am a classical Jungian, that my perspective in terms of Jungian psychology and Jungian theory is really along the lines of a classical Jungian. Ettinger is also, he's like the most classical Jungian. He's like the Jungian, missionary. So I love Ettinger. I pull from Ettinger a lot. So that explains that. But I'll keep reading. One thing promises to become clear. Wilson and Jung shared an intuitive religious sense that allowed them to channel the wisdom of the collective unconscious, resulting in striking similarities. Thus, we do both of them a great disservice by neglecting to thoughtfully compare and contrast their ideas regarding religious conversion, especially considering that in today's world, so many who don't know where to find anything of real meaning and value have desperately turned toward drugs and alcohol in an attempt to fill what we in the fellowships have aptly named a God-shaped hole. And so, with that, I will turn it back over. So, let's see.
The screen is jumping around. Everyone, please unmute. I can make that possible for you. Yes.
Oh,
Let's have a collective
absolutely brilliant.
sounds of appreciation.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Wow.
another home run.
Wow.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go back to muting everyone. Maybe, oh, I don't know how to do that. Can somebody mute everyone? How do I do that?
I'll do that.
Thank you. Okay, back to
Cody, you need to unmute yourself then. And Duncan also.
okay. Whew, boy, we got a hot flash today. That was the perfect speed. Riveting. Thank you, Cody. Okay, wow. I get into an altered state and then I have to be the host again. So bear with me here. This is a time we'll open up for questions and answers. Each person will have about 1 minute to reflect or ask a question, and Cody will do his best to answer. And so if you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand. I have a question, so I'll start off since I don't see any hands yet. Two things. One thing that I talk about with people quite a lot, I was talking about it on an outreach call with a newcomer today. I'm a scientific method man myself. Figuring things out is not one of the steps. Recovery works, in my experience and from my observations, by people practicing certain actions and getting results. Explore, find out what you get, make adjustments, keep practicing, get results. That's one idea. You might like to comment on that. The other one is my sponsor is always ranting about how the original name of the AA Big Book was going to be The Way Out. And at the original meetings, anyone was welcome to come, not just alcoholics. But the book was entitled Alcoholics Anonymous, and my sponsor thinks that has caused problems and isolated us from society. That's it for me. Thanks for listening.
I love that. You know, when I was new and so I actually agree with the first statement. I'll try to remember to get back to the second one regarding the name, but so you know, in the early days of me attending AA, you know, old timers would tell me all the time that I was too smart for my own good. You know, you can't overthink this thing, and I didn't really understand what they were referring to. Um, you know, I had a spiritual experience when I was young, and then I was about 18 when it happened, and you know, I had the white light experience, very similar to what Wilson describes. And I loved what Shaberg said yesterday, right? Is that 6 months later, that white light experience wasn't helping Bill. You know, he had to do something new. And that was certainly my experience as well. Like the white light experience, actually, for me, it prohibited me for many years of really understanding the program because I imagined, you know, that the ego suffers from a delusion of sovereignty. And I imagined that I already knew spiritual stuff, right? And that somehow I just needed to get back to what I had before. And so yeah, I think that in the beginning we don't want to overthink it, right? That we actually need to really become open and allow the ego needs to step back and let, because it needs to be open and allow new information to come in and not to pretend or imagine that it has the answers, right? And to let something else dictate. I think that's where the program starts. But I also think that and it's just my experience, but that after a certain amount of time in the program, that we come up, I feel like the ego individuates, right? And that eventually we get to a point where those answers that meant so much in the very early days, they don't really fit the bill anymore, right? Like, for example, if I'm calling my sponsor once a month about the same problem, month after month after month, and he starts to run out of stuff to tell me to do, just that, oh, this will go away. You call me with this every month, right? Then chances are, like, there's something else that's missing and there's still work for me to do. And it is possible that my sponsor or the 12, you know, the 12 steps or whatever you want to say doesn't have all the answers for me. And so I need to look somewhere else and I need to keep going deeper. Now for me personally, I love AA and I'm still 12 steps, whatever it is. I'm very committed to my 12-step practice, right? It is the foundation of my life. But I also have found things that were just as meaningful as the 12 steps early on. I've found things in my seeking outside now as I try to build onto this foundation that are just as meaningful and profound. And so that's what I think we're trying to do here is you know, it's clear to me that, like, there's two types of people in the rooms, right? One type are the type who are just fine there. They have the container, they don't need to question it, it works, right? They can run everything through that container and they may never see beyond it, right? And we all know those kinds of people, right? They're hiding out in the rooms. But then there's people like us probably on this call who just aren't good with those answers anymore, and we're seeking for more. So that's how I'd answer that. As far as the second thing, you know, I guess Duncan says no.
Forget it. Let's go to Jim.
Okay.
Thank you, Cody. Come on in, Jim. Oh, I have to invite you. Sorry. Hold on. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there is a question in here. Given what I've missed you guys this past couple of weeks. I really have. Hearing you all talk tonight, and it's great to hear this more. Given what you said at the beginning of the discussion, and I feel a bit embarrassed to say this because I've never spoken of it before. When I was in I think my third year at uni, and I was reading some whatever material I was reading at the time. Hopefully, it wasn't The Hobbit because I wasn't doing an English literature course. I had this feeling that within all of us, there is a God. We are all God-like, and as I've heard in maybe some other fellowship, made in the image of God. That would describe that. So that for me was I didn't realize it at the time, but I was my spiritual. I was having a spiritual development, but I didn't realize it. And when I came out of uni and I stepped back into the dysfunctional family and so on and so forth, I reverted back to what I was pre-spiritual, and now this past period, which has brought me to Friendly Circle Berlin and so on, and traveling this path again. How do I not lose this spiritualism? Yeah, not go back to how things were in the past. Keeping in the present and maintaining it in the future.
So I think I understood the question is, and I think it's just a really great question, is how do I not lose this connection and this spiritual momentum? And I'm actually reminded of the conversation I had yesterday with Bill Shaberg when, there was a group down south somewhere, whatever, in the United States, and it turns out that they were drinking beer during their meetings, right? And they wrote a letter to Bill Wilson. They said, Bill Wilson, you've got to come down here, get someone down here. They can't do that, right? And Bill said, I'm not too worried about it. The beer will take care of that, And I think that that little story applies to your question because I know for me in my life, I don't have to worry too much about getting too far off the beam or off track, or because when I do get off, it doesn't take very long before I start feeling really uncomfortable. And it so the psyche, right, that unconscious, it drives me back to it. So I think that I don't think that there's any amount of discipline, like for me, that's going to keep. I don't do things because I'm a disciplined person. I do things because I like to do them. And if I stop liking something, I'm not going to do it for very much longer. And I'm very grateful that for me personally, the discipline manifests in like this seeking and writing and reading and stuff. And I think that a lot of us do experience that in the same way. So, one thing I'll try to wrap this up, but it's that I used to drink alcohol or smoke marijuana or use methamphetamines or whatever, like all day, like first thing in the morning. And then I would just do it the rest of the day because it did something and it treated that thing in me, that sort of that angst. Right. And what I've found is that doing this work does the same thing. And so I do this work first thing in the morning when I wake up, just like I used to drink. And then it carries me through the rest of the day. And it doesn't feel like I need to practice discipline in doing it. So thanks for your question, Jim.
Thank you, Cody. Patrick.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Duncan, everybody else on the call. Yeah, another powerful presentation. And the one slide you had on, which ended with the words, whether we are religious or not, that resonated with me, and it reminded me of Meister Eckhart's statement that if we wake up one morning and find there's a chasm between me and God, I can be sure that I'm the one who has moved away. And Eckhart plays a lot, plays a big role in Jung's view of the world. So I was thinking about Joseph Campbell's hero's journey as a vehicle to knit together the approach, the individuation approach of Jung and the approach of the 12 steps. Are you going to be touching on Campbell's hero's journey later in the book, or did you make a conscious decision to leave that out of this book?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I did make the conscious decision to leave it out. I do, and I love like the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. I've got a really big snippet in the coming chapters from that book. And I think that it's a super profound approach, and I think it's spot on. And I think there's other books that have been written too about the 12 steps and the hero's journey and stuff. So I felt like for me, there wasn't a lot of new information to get out since he's so popular and stuff. But yeah, but you know, the hero's journey begins with a plunge into the dark, right? And I love the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Like there's so many little snippets in there that remind me of like the 12 steps. Like there's, if I remember, there's one story about, you know, uh, just coming across like these strange characters and these weird, you know, these weird creatures and how they're like, they're there to help you and guide you. And yeah, early on, I thought I would end up including more of that in my book, but I just didn't. So, but it's highly recommended. It's called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So, thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, and one final thought that crossed my mind in the course of this presentation: individuation, right? I mean, the meaning of the word individual cannot be separated. So there's a word which really has got momentum in what appears to be two different directions, right? Because ultimately individuation means the same as yoga or religion, right? So that's something new that came to me this evening. Thank you.
I really like that. That's amazing. It is, the individuation is sort of the it's the fruits of religion or yoga, right? That's beautiful.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks, Cody. Cody, got a question from Danny in the chat. Are the 12 steps enough? I worry because I'm not sure it was even enough for Bill Wilson in the end.
That's a great question. And that, you know, I think the 12 steps are enough for some people. You know, I have friends that I've tried to encourage to do more work, and they're just like, no, man, I'm doing inventory. You know, I'm like, bro, you inventoried that last month and the month before, the month before. But if they're okay with that, that's okay. I mean, whatever. It's not my, it's really not my position to say whether the 12 steps are enough for a certain person or not. I know that for me personally, the 12 steps weren't enough. They were enough to get me to where I needed something else though. So I really had to start there. But I've come to this realization lately is that if you've done the 12 steps and then you are willing to admit that you need more help, perhaps professional help from like a good psychologist or something, then that means the 12 steps worked. You know, they got you to a place where and you're honest enough with yourself that there's more to be done. And that's really the essence of this whole thing, right? Is to recognize that we don't have the answers and that we don't have the answers available to us, and that we have to keep searching and keep seeking. And so when I started doing therapy, I was probably about 9 years sober, maybe 10 years sober. I think I was 9 years sober. And my therapy experience changed when I approached therapy with the same open mind that I had brought into the 12-step rooms, you know, 10 years previously. Just that, hey, I don't have the answers and I need you to help me and help me see what I'm missing, right? That's the key. Like, what parts of me are unavailable to my ego? And to try to bring those out and make those conscious. So
Thanks, Cody. I'll add that 12 steps for me goes much further and deeper than AA. So I move deeper into Al-Anon. Every AA qualifies as an Al-Anon. If you're an AA, you qualify for Al-Anon. Come check it out. And then ACA. ACA is the farthest, deepest I've found for 12 steps. So plus other things outside of 12 step. I want as much as I can find along the way. Derek, come on in.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
no. I will get to a question. I'm a bit ill today in my head, but I've loved the talk, right? And it's a bit like it's bringing up a couple of things. See if we can get a question out of this. It's just that the 12 step. People go on about the program. Oh, it's a very hard book to read. You see, some people go. I said, wait till you read fucking Young, right? Jesus Christ, it is just that I think it's one of these discussions which I'm really loving. I genuinely am. Young was a really brainy academic, right? And he was very much into precise language. Some of his stuff, fucking, you need a degree just to go through some of his passages. Now, Bill, and by default, Hank, because Hank helped him a lot writing the big book. What were they? Two sales guys, ultimately, yeah? It's just that, and they were wrapping up a lot of stuff, right? And they wanted to get the book to sell and get it out wide and far. So again, when we do the comparisons nowadays between sort of say Young, which academic, and Bill, or Bill and Hank, because again, Hank did help him a lot, right? Is you got two sales guys, and people say, what does that really mean? How do we dissect that? Because what they made it between the pair of them deliberately vague, because I'm an old sales guy. What do I mean? If I leave it simply vague, what's the best question you can get asked or asked? I don't know. See? So people can look into something and just look at it this way, look at it that way, and everybody has their own perspectives. Now at Young, you read a lot of Young, he's very precise, and you can still get lost in his readings. You know what I mean at this stage. But I suppose it's just pure, but never underestimate pure blind luck. And what do I mean? Is it that you had the alcohol chunk, because we would look at our history. I'm saying if we looked at a history, Young's in it a bit, right? But we go back to the Washingtonians, the Oxford group, blah, 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 right? See, and that created I get there, Duncan. I told you I'm a bit ill at the moment, right? So therefore they stumble into this, but it's just a coincidence on one level that it's aligned with a lot of Jungian stuff, because I suppose I knew I'd get to a question, right? Genuinely, how much fucking stuff did Bill Wilson and Hank read of Jung stuff? See, in 1935, 36, 37, 38, because he was quite new. Jung was, you know what I mean? And Jesus Christ, I struggle today, and I'm fucking somebody who went to college. Neither of those two feckers did, right? So therefore, it's just a bit of luck. And when comparison with Young, I know these, and I do love it, but this is we're the Russian fucking space program. We'll wait for it, right? Because basically it's a story of two pens. Well, the Americans came up with a Papermate pen, could write ink upside down, spent millions. The Russians said, how do you write in space? A pencil. See, we're the pencil. Hey, Duncan's still doing his thing. I told you I'm not well. I got to. I don't know if there's a question in there, Cody, or maybe I just had a waffle. So I apologize to everybody.
No problem. By the way, too, I was looking at your background and stuff, I was like, wow, that looks really comfortable and fluffy. That's amazing. So yeah, no, I mean, and that's the thing about it, is that Wilson didn't have I mean, he didn't read Jung before he had written the big book. But and later on in the book too, there are just so many similarities between what he came up with and what Jung was kind of putting out there, which just, I think it says a lot about it. It's not even necessarily that it's not to really worship Bill Wilson or anything, but it's just to point out that we really, it's more evidence of the collective unconscious, right? That we're all really kind of on the same path. And that the more connected we are to ourselves, the more connected we are to everybody else. So yeah, I mean, I know Bill did some therapy with the Jungian, I think after he published the big book. And so, and he had, he learned a lot about ego from Dr. Thibault, if I remember right. Ming might be able to correct me, or one of you guys. But he, so yeah, but the thing is that, you know, the 12 steps, you know, they grew out of Wilson's own experience. That's why I like that statement from Schaberg so much, right? It's he wasn't just copying some stuff from the Oxford group, right? But he was actually he was writing his own experience. And so all that stuff that's new in the 12 steps that wasn't in the Oxford group, that's the good stuff. That's the stuff that came right out of Wilson's, his own kind of, you know, his own unconscious, and really becomes this part about this program that works so well for us.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Cody. Carrie.
Thank you. And I'm new to this particular meeting, and
Welcome.
thank you. And it's been nice to listen in, but you know, talking about, you know, that spirituality and you know, that flash of light, you know, I sit on the fence when it comes to religion. I am a spiritual being, I believe, having a human experience, not the other way around. However, that's my own feeling and outlook of what I've experienced through recovery, through addiction, and before. And but there's also, just because I came into recovery certainly hasn't protected me from any dark side. It was there when I was in active addiction, and it's still around me now. And I don't see how any book, forgive my accent, can protect me from that. The experiences that I have with dark sides still to this day, and I'm sober, is quite frightening, really.
Do you have a question, Carrie?
Yeah, so my question is, you know, from this angle, you know, what sort of you know, what extra does this give in you know, that spiritual growth that I need, you know, to be armed with any more facts in regards to staying well and staying protected from what seems to be, from what I've just heard, you're digging quite deep into spirituality.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and thanks for sharing too, because I think that you know, that is I mean, it is the human experience, right, to have a dark side. And you know, the quote that I read earlier from Jung is that, you know, we don't attain enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And so, and I really appreciate that Jung saw that, right? And it's not about, it's you know, he's not encouraging us to change what in us is dark, right? But it's more about almost becoming comfortable with being dark. You know, he says that humankind is murky, right? Not light, and not all the way light, not all the way dark, but murky. And so he was murky. Bill Wilson was murky. I'm murky. You know, I've got a light and a dark side. But spiritual power comes when we can actually. So if in Jung uses this metaphor, which is really, really helpful for me. He talks about it as if it were like an electrical current, right? And if I'm not an electrician or, you know, an electrical engineer, but I would imagine that if I only have the positive pole of electricity, I don't actually have a spark, right? That what happens to create that energy is when the positive and the negative, they join together in a common channel. That's what creates energy in the world, right? In the universe, in physis, right? In the physical world. It's the same in the realm of the soul or the psyche or the spiritual. That in order to really generate transformative energy, we have to harness both sides of that equation. And that means that we become conscious and accepting of our dark side as just as powerful and poignant in the spiritual experience as anything we discover in the realm of the light. So keep coming, I mean, I hope you can, I mean, I post these on my website, the book. This really is, I love your question and your comment, because it is literally the underlying message in my book, The Shadow of a Figure of Light. And I'm happy to answer your questions. We have the WhatsApp group, so you can ask questions in there and stuff. So hopefully we can, I welcome, and I'm really glad that you shared, and thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks, Cody. Melissa.
Thanks again, Cody. I, first of all, really appreciate the pace of today. It was just a tiny bit slower and my brain could hear it better. So thanks so much for however that was presented. You know, in today's topic, you were really talking about individuation and that being such a key word for Jung. And I'm thinking about the word integration too, that a lot of therapists try to help us get integrated with all the parts, which you're talking about right now, which little Miss Carrie mentioned, all the parts that I felt were so inadmissible, wouldn't want the public to see. But I got to bring that in and wrap my arms around it in order to be whole. And in that word integration is the word integer and wholeness. And I have one face now. I used to have 500 faces that I used to wear depending on the circumstances. So that ability to live comfortably in my skin most places is a gift of recovery that I only learned by being in meetings and working the steps and fumbling through them, not perfectly. The thing I also caught on your share today was about how what is going on? A new something is being created. We're part of this movement. We've all had a transformative experience as a result of the steps. What this new thing that's going on when we sit at meetings, haven't many of us thought, oh my God, I just wish everybody could get this. You know, you kind of have that secret wish that all the hurting hearts out there could just come to recovery. And this one old timer says it so well. He goes, yeah, the whole world needs it. But if they all show up at the meeting, I'm leaving. I love that because it's like, I kind of want to save my little private like healing place for myself. I don't want the whole world coming. Anyway, just reflections on how much great gratitude I have for the way you present these profound concepts. I couldn't have been ready for this a year ago. I needed all this healing more inside me to be able to receive what you have. So thank you so much. No
Thank you.
question, I guess just thanks, you know.
I love it. Thank you for coming, and you're very supportive. I appreciate it. I'm really glad you're here. So it's amazing.
Thanks, Melissa. I want to bring up IFS into this light dark integration, because one of the messages from IFS, internal family systems, that I really love, and it was suggested in the chat that IFS may be another emerging myth. And you might comment on that. But one of the messages in IFS is that there are no bad parts. I need to stop trying to get rid of parts of myself and meet and embrace all the parts of myself to eventually experience integration and to bring that positive negative connection for my full empowerment and so forth. And IFS is a way of, for me, of exploring that and feeling encouraged to explore that, what I had thought was a darker side.
Yes. And I love what I know of IFS is really useful, because it kind of gives a shape or a symbol to those dark energies, right? And then I think once they become sort of concretized like that, they're no longer you know, they're becoming more conscious. And then I think the journey of IFS is to try to continue to integrate until we can see really all of it come together as one. So, and I do have to warn you guys, my battery has only 4%. I don't know why it's not plugged in, but if I disappear, that's why. So
We'll carry on without you. Let's hear from Annalise before you run out of power.
Hi. That was really interesting. Sometimes I find it all hard to follow, no offense, but it's just my brain can't take it all in. But I did follow what you just said, Duncan, in terms of saying that there's no bad parts. And I have to remember that for myself. But the other lesson I need to learn, and I'm trying here, is to learn there's no bad parts in other people. And that one's harder to see. Is it reflects on what the other person's needs are, and feelings perhaps covered up in all other kinds of shadows and light. Thanks for letting me say that.
Thank you.
thank you, Annalise. You know, God bless. I'm glad you're here. It's really true, right? And I think that the more I'm able to see my own darkness, the more I can learn to accept the darkness in other people, you know, and you know, remove myself from situations that might be harmful. So yeah. Ming's over here trying to help me get plugged in, so I appreciate it.
Thank you. Jeff. Whoops. Hold on. Let's get you unmuted. I hit the button twice. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. Jeff here. Cody, so thank you so much for your book. We've got in LA, we've got a wonderful young library and bookshop combined. And I've been picking up some of those books. Probably the most seminal experience I've had was sitting Zen, and I'll go to those week-long sessions sometimes. And that's how I get in touch with my dark side, because I don't get to go anywhere. I don't get to run away. And I had one particular experience where I really was full of rage and hatred, and I hated myself. I hated everybody around me. I hated the practice. It's all bullshit. You know, I was even hallucinating. I was so out of my sorts. And then my knee was driving me crazy with pain, and all of a sudden something came and sat down beside me and just said, I know you hate this, but we're going to sit here. And I think that was the very first integration of my dark side I've ever, experienced, where I actually was compassionate toward this side of myself that I just, could hardly bear to look at. And it was, it's stuck with me ever since. So, I mean, that to me kind of resonates with some of the stuff you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That sounds like a really I mean, the first thing that comes to me is like, I would probably feel the same way if I was in a retreat that I was supposed to meditate for a week or whatever, I would probably have a similar reaction, I love that. I think it's the profound thing that happens here is just that the psyche has it's an autonomous phenomenon, right? And we're familiar with this in the 12 steps, because we know that we have the obsession to drink, or the phenomenon of craving, or whatever it is, so there is this sort of, there's something that's taking place beyond our conscious awareness that is more powerful than consciousness itself, right? And that was the great discovery that Jung had made, and and we get to enjoy that discovery as well, because Bill Wilson found the same thing, just through his own experience. So
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Cody. We are at the top of the hour. 90 minutes has gone by. So let's close the formal book study gathering, and then we'll have fellowship time. Is that okay with you, Cody?
yeah, that sounds good. And I'll stop the recording right now.
All right.